There we go. Okay, so last Tuesday we kind of had our introduction to visual music in a sense, and I would argue that there's a couple different threads of visual music depending on who you talk to. So, talking to someone from a musical perspective, this is one thread of visual music that we'll discuss. And as it goes on, it kind of splinters, and that idea of what visual music is um, can differ if you're talking to someone who's lodged in the visual arts. So just a note of clarification that this little take is much more on the musical side. And I would argue kind of a different approach to 20th century musical history that you won't hear very often. And so that'll be even more apparent today as we look at some of those links between those two modalities, between art and music. So I asked you to, look at the films that we had looked at last time. I'm not going to try to quiz or anything like that. I just hope you'll look at them and examine them and kind of put them to memory. Because I wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on with those and what differentiates them, and kind of actually which one will look more toward what we will study. So basically looking at three of them right now, looking at the the Walter Ruttmann piece, the Lichtspiel, Opus 1, which has sort of a musical title, right? And there we see sort of this relationship between forms unfolding in time, so painting in time. So obviously the time part of that becomes the musical part of that. And that music is a time-based art. And I would probably argue one of the foremost time-based arts in that it relies heavily on time. You almost cannot make music without time. I guess someone could argue that you can, but it would be difficult. And so it used to be that painting is something that you could experience kind of outside of time, but then putting it into time changes it. And the Ruttmann piece actually had some music, as you will recall, and that music was written in conjunction with that piece. So it was written by someone else, but it would be played live in the theater. So at that time, there was no way to actually record synchronously audio onto the video track. The piece slipped my mind. Rhythmus 23, of which there was like Rhythmus 21 and Rhythmus 23. So I think this is Rhythmus 21. He did a series of works that kind of toured, and those films would actually sometimes have music with them and sometimes not, and the music would change. And so it's kind of this in between sort of like, yeah, music can go with this, but it's not necessarily vital. It's not integral to the piece itself. And then lastly, we had this Viking Egeling piece, where there is no music at all, that the visual music is quite literal, right? It is just paintings in time, right? There is no music ever that was slated for that. Egeling died quite young. I think he died in 1925, so he died in the youth of the visual music genre, I suppose. Anybody have any comments about those particular works? Were they hard to watch?
None were really hard to watch. I would never.
I, I thought the musical components of them were the things that I didn't really enjoy that much. But visually, it
D'accord.
was great
Agree.
to watch.
What didn't you like about the music?
It was just like kind of standard. I
It's
felt,
like music.
what's that?
I'm sorry. Like I agree with you. I feel like it wasn't really tied together as well as it could have. I don't know.
Yeah, there's some sort of mismatch there, right? I mean, we have this sort of butting of heads like, wow, that music for this it seems odd. I mean, such a radical movement of art, right? And then such a not radical musical approach. Like, well, what is it seems like music is kind of an afterthought here, right? And I think that is actually a really pointed and correct assessment that music is secondary in this particular approach, that we are looking basically at abstract film, and film is thought to be purely visual at this time. And so, yeah, we'll throw some music with it too. And the type of music chosen doesn't necessarily reflect the sort of modern or contemporary flair of what's going on. So I wanted to read something in just a second. Does anybody else have any thoughts about the? Well, sometimes I wonder, what do we do when we go to an art museum? What is that? You try to get a kid to go, and it's like torture for them because they don't know exactly what to do with themselves. I think that sometimes this abstract film helps because there is a limited duration for how long you're supposed to look at it. So from a purely just naive perspective, in some way that's comforting to me to know that it lasts 10 minutes and that's how long you're supposed to look at it, right? And after that, you're free to think about it. Whereas if we go and look at a Jackson Pollock, for instance, then how long am I supposed to actually examine this painting? I have a good story about that. It's not a good story. I have a story about that. When I saw a Jackson Pollock painting in the San Jose Museum of Modern Art. And I was looking at this. They had a series of them, which was amazing. And I went and looked, and they were, there's a lot going on. It's a very active sort of painting. It doesn't look like anything except what it is. So I was kind of looking at it and thinking a lot about it. And a guy came in and he looked at it for about 2 seconds and said, "That's crap," and he moved on. So I thought that was an interesting take. Like, oh, well, he knows what he's looking for.
I like to think about how those kinds of people were wrong whenever I'm looking at modern art, particularly because lately I've been thinking a lot about what goes into actually deciding to do something that might be considered avant-garde, whatever that means. And that I don't know. There was a Law and Order episode that Lauren was watching the other day, and this is related, I promise. And it's they went into a modern art museum, and there was this woman standing on a ladder. She threw a bucket of paint down. They thought she dropped it, but she did it on purpose. And they were like, "Oh, is that art?" And it was like, well, think of all the thought process that had to go into getting up on a ladder and throwing a bucket of paint at the ground. You had to decide to do that. There's a lot of stuff going on there when you think about it. There's a lot of creative freedom happening to get you to that decision. And that's what I like to think about when I'm looking at pieces of art. Well, what made this person do this? And even if I come up with the wrong reason why a person decided to do that particular thing, it's still, interesting to think about. It still, yields to my creative process later on down the road at some point.
Sure. I like what I sent you guys a link if you're on the Discord music tech server. And Brian Eno has this to say, which I thought was interesting. He said, "Stop thinking about artworks as objects and start thinking about them as triggers for experiences. That solves a lot of problems. We don't have to argue whether photographs are art or whether performances are art or whether Carl Andre's bricks or Andrew Serrano's piss or Little Richard's long tall Sally are art. Because we say art is something that happens, a process, not a quality, and all sorts of things can make it happen. What makes a work of art good for you is not something that is already inside it, but sometimes something that happens inside you. So the value of a work lies in the degree to which it can help you have the kind of experience that you call art." So that is sort of a subjective take on art, where we say that art in itself, an artwork in itself, doesn't necessarily hold art. That art lies within you. So in a sense, when someone walks into a museum and says that's crap, that means the art inside them has failed. It did not trigger. And so that's not for them. And I think that's okay. I think it would be better for a person if they decided, I'm going to allow a lot of things to trigger art inside me. And of course, you're more likely to do that if you're an artist.
I would say it's actually good. Although he should have looked at it longer, it's great that he had a response to it, though, rather than just why are we here,
Yeah, I think his response was much like my response to George Crumb when I was young, to which I got really angry about it. I did sit through the whole thing, but I was angry about it. It made me mad, which is weird. I did have some sort of reaction to it, right? It triggered something to me, which I guess is in a sense a reaction to art. And it really challenged everything I knew, and that a response to that challenge was anger, and later curiosity and acceptance of that. So there can be sort of this emotional roller coaster of art and music that challenges you a little bit, or kind of looks past your assumptions, I suppose.
But you can also be a connoisseur of that type of art, that type of abstract art, or expressionist art, and then in like one expressionist artist but hate another too. So you could also hate Jackson Pollock. You might even be really good at it. You can tell it is a Jackson Pollock, and you can say, oh, I hate how he always uses the same pattern in these like 4 quadrants of the paint. So sometimes I think it's good to have a sensibility within each medium, or taste, like preferences, because I think that is, for me, helpful in art, where it's like, oh, which 50s big band jazz trombonist do I like, and which one don't I like, and why? Or why do I like one more than the other?
I think they're all named T-Bone.
I've just never looked at something and felt like angry enough to like actually, attack it verbally. Like, I don't know. I've never listened to like, or maybe I've listened to like music before and been like, oh yeah, this sucks. But I've never felt like an overwhelming sense of anger about it. So that's curious to me.
That with movies sometimes.
Me, I feel like, well, what am I not understanding about this? And as I've gotten older, that's become more and more prevalent, in that like, I really want to know what I'm missing. If somebody else says something is good, like the other day I listened to a whole Carly Rae Jepsen album, and I don't like that artist, or I didn't, and now I do, because I listened to it and I thought about, oh, this is really good pop music. It's just like, like what I want to figure out what's wrong with me, why I don't like Schoenberg. Like, people in music theory class always freak out about it. They get mad. And I never felt that. I was always like, I want to know why people listen to this. Like, I want to experience this too.
Right. I agree with you there. And with everything, I think that if you don't get it, it can be frustrating, because what you're looking for is for that art to activate inside you. And when it doesn't, or it doesn't activate the art that you're familiar with. So Schoenberg, for instance, if you're familiar with a lot of tonal music that sort of has this way of activating that sort of art thought in you, you will not get that art thought from Schoenberg. And therefore you may think that it is not effective. But I would argue that it is effective in triggering a different art thought within me. But it's a different art thought. And it's good at that, but I had to work at it a little bit too. Anyway, thanks for looking at those things. And I want to read a little bit about what other people write about it. So this is about abstract film in general. And this is from Marcel Schwerin and Sandra Neumann. And this is out of a compendium about audiovisual things. This is about what they call absolute film. So abstract film is thought to have originated in the 1910s, shortly after the cultural revolutionizing innovation of abstract painting, which, in view of its non-mimetic, that means it doesn't look like anything, treatment of artistic material, had oriented itself toward music. In an article with the salient title Abstract Cinema, Chromatic Music, originally published in 1912, the futurist Bruno Cora describes the filmic experiments he carried out with his brother Arnaldo Gina. However, neither has one of these early experiments survived, nor has the showing of an abstract film during this period been documented. So in the teens, we don't have any surviving stuff. The beginning of the history of abstract film, therefore, begins with the work Lichtspiel, Opus 1, which we know, by Walter Ruttmann, which premiered in Berlin in 1921. It's a painted, hand-colored animation film whose presentation was accompanied by live music composed by Max Buding. Beginning in 1923, the Rhythmus films by Hans Richter were shown under different titles. Followed in 1925 by Symphonie Diagonale, Diagonal Symphony, by Viking Egling. These works already demonstrate essential elements of abstract film. The makers of all three were visual artists and also considered their works as examples of painting with time. In their films, they sought to examine the nature of the relationship between forms and their temporal development, and clearly indicated this reference to musical principles in the titles of these films. At the same time, there was also considerable differences between the three pioneering works. Rootmans had its own score written specifically for the film. The film therefore works with coordinated auditory and visual rhythms, whereas the Diagonal Symphony was consciously intended to be silent, developing the rhythm solely by means of the image. Richter's film, on the other hand, was sometimes shown with and sometimes without musical accompaniment, as we discussed. However, a break occurred in abstract film very early on. In 1925, within the scope of the Matinee der Absolute Film, the Absolute Film in Berlin, not only were abstract German films presented, but French works as well, such as Ballet Mécanique and Entr'acte by René Clair. Both Rootman and Richter subsequently turned away from abstract film. Eggeling died in 1925. Unlike the German film artists, Leger, Murphy, and Clair, the French, did not rely on translating music into abstract forms. Rather, they used real shots that they assembled according to the principles of collage and montage. They aspired toward a synthesis of the art of sound and image in close collaboration with contemporary composers such as George Antheil and Eric Satie. I think that's quite interesting because now we have a German and French thread. And often we talk about this in the 1950s with regard to musique concrète and electronic music of the Germans. And so somebody tell me what the relationship is there.
Between musique concrète and what?
Well, so in the 1950s we have musique concrète and elektronische Musik. The Germans have electronic music, and their goals are actually totally different.
Well, I don't know why Al's not already talking because I know she knows about this. But I would say the Germans want to make the sounds and the French want to find the sounds.
That's right. So there's some parallel here, right? Where in the 1950s in musique concrète, the French are wanting to use found sounds and to find the inner structure of existing recorded sounds, whereas the Germans want to build sounds from the ground up. They want to find some sort of fundamental connection at some basic level between the synthesis components and the whole sound. So here again, we see that same trend, and actually 30 years or 20 years before the work of either one of those, anybody in those countries in those fields. Oskar Fischinger continued the tradition of German abstract film, introducing three significant innovations. R1, Ein Formspiel, a play on form, which I have not been able to find that film. Apparently, it's a silent multi-projection whose breathtaking tempo is still surprising even today. A precursor to expanded cinema, which we'll talk about later, developed out of color light plays. Okay, so that's what we already talked about, and so hopefully that reading maybe seems a little bit understandable to you. Like, oh yeah, I get all of that. I watched all those films, and I understand what this person is talking about. And so what we're going to talk about more today is what happens when we're able to actually synchronize sound and video, and how did that actually happen? Because that's a huge development as far as a media art goes, to be able to put sound exactly synchronized with image. And they were not doing that in the 1920s in these abstract films. It wasn't really possible. But we'll watch a couple videos here about how things actually work. One is rather dry, and then one is rather dramatized. So let me pull. Go ahead.
Like trap drummers ever? Was that a thing that ever crossed over? Because that was a thing in the popular films of the era before the 20s. But
you know, I guess with with what we saw with Lin Lai, you know, where he had this sort of percussion soundtrack underneath. I guess that kind of hints to it, right? But I don't know of any examples that purely just use the trap set in this regard. That was more reserved for, I guess, popular film. But I could be.
It's kind of strange because if you've ever listened to one, it's very abstract sounding percussion. Like, it doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, I know that Oskar Fischinger has some interesting things to say about percussion. And we'll look at that a little later, actually. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to your question. It's a good question. Okay, so let's look at, technically speaking, and I will share my screen in a sec. my God. Okay. Sorry, I fixed something earlier and it's not fixed anymore, so I have to go to the right place again. Here we go. All right, so here we go. I will share my screen. I'll share it. Share the sound, share this. There we go. And so this is one of these older sort of films that is going to tell us about how it is that we record sound on the optical film. And I will let it do the explaining. I don't hear any sound.
For use as part of a talking picture, the sound to accompany the photographed action must be recorded for reproduction when the picture is shown. The most desirable material for this purpose has been found to be the photographic film. The finished film employed for reproduction in the motion picture theater, therefore, carries not only the picture of the action that is to be seen, as it did in the silent picture days, but also the photographic record of the sound that is to be. The sound and picture are usually photographed on separate films, which are called negatives. These negatives are combined by ordinary photographic printing to produce the positive print which is used in the theater to reproduce the original picture and sound. Since the photographic film is affected only by light, it is necessary for the recording of sound to convert the sound waves to corresponding changes in light. As I speak, the sound waves produced by my voice are transmitted through the air to the microphone, where these sound waves are converted to changes in an electric current. These variations in the electric current are then amplified and used to control the light falling on the photographic film. The light that falls upon the photographic film is in the form of a fine, bright line extending transversely of the direction in which the film moves. The part of the film on which the line of light falls to make the photographic sound record is called the sound track. When the line of light is so placed as normally to extend part way across the sound track, and the sound-controlled variations cause the position of one end of the line to move transversely of the track, a record known as a unilateral variable area soundtrack is produced. When both ends of the line of light are caused to move transversely of the track, a record known as a bilateral variable area soundtrack is produced. When the line of light extends completely across the sound track, and the thickness of the line is varied by the sound-controlled current variations, a record known as a variable density soundtrack is produced. All of these sound records contain photographic records of light variations corresponding to the pressure variations in the original sound. If either a variable area or a variable density sound record is run past a narrow line of light from a fixed source, and the light, after passing through the film, is visually observed, the amount of light reaching the observer is constantly varying from instant to instant. If the eye were capable of quantitatively measuring the light, it would see that the amount of light reaching it from either sound record varies in exactly the same way. There are in common use today electrical devices which will quantitatively measure what the eye can only approximate. The photoelectric cell is one such device and is universally used in the reproduction of photographic sound records. The reproducer system to which you are now listening contains such a photoelectric cell. This varying beam of light falling on the photoelectric cell produces variations in the electric current which are directly proportional to the variations in the light beam. As the varying electrical current in the photoelectric cell is small, A vacuum tube amplifier is required to increase it to the point where it will operate a loudspeaker. The loudspeaker converts the varying electrical current into sound waves, which are the counterpart of the sound waves falling on the microphone in the recording studio. To review, in the recording process, the original sound waves are converted to varying electrical current. The varying electrical current is converted to variations in a light beam, and the varying light beam produces a photographic sound record. In the reproducing process, the photographic sound record is used to produce a varying beam of light. The varying beam is converted into varying electrical current, and the varying electrical current is then converted back into sound waves. Since the advent of successful talking pictures in the late 20s, nearly all variable density photographic sound recording has been done by means of a device known as the light valve. The light valve contains two very thin metallic...
Okay, and so details, if you're curious about that, you can watch it offline. Online, offline.
Right? Like light pipe.
Yeah, it's kind of like ADAT light pipe, except that's more of like a digital idea. So here we have, you know, an analog of sound in visual form, which, wow, I think that's called indexical relationship of sound and light. So here we have some direct representation, which is really fascinating, given that we're talking about visual music. It seems really apropos. So that's happening, right? And I have one more film to show regarding that. Wow, okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is the noise in the recording caused by the conversion of light to sound, or is it because of the reproduction through like a record or something?
Well, we probably this, you know, when films get old, they probably have noise that gets on them. They are an analog medium, film, right? And so any sort of visual disturbance, so I would equate it to the sort of visual disturbance you might see in a film, like little things that actually get on the film and mess it up. I mean, that's going to cause this sort of crackling, because there's no way to keep those visual disturbances off of the optical soundtrack either. So my guess is that it probably sounded better when the film first came out than it does later. I would also argue that this method of reproducing sound is not the one that we stuck with. There's probably a good reason.
I also have a question. So would they usually stick with the condensed version, or would they go between unilateral and bilateral, or like would they? I guess it depends on whoever recorded.
I think at first we had this sort of density. It looks like the gradient, right? I think that was the original idea. And then it actually takes a mirror that has to oscillate kind of to reflect the light to actually make those variable area ones. So in the end, it went to the variable area. The variable density, I think, was the early technology, and then eventually it went to the variable. The variable density was the early technology, and then it went to the variable area. And when Oscar Fischinger, who we'll talk about in a second, works with it in the 1930s, he kind of assumes this variable area because it looks more like a waveform, and it actually is a waveform.
Yeah.
That we could draw and make sense of. Okay, so one more video here to talk more about this particular phenomenon of sound on film. Here's one that's dramatized. It looks like it's from the History Channel or something like that. So we'll watch that. And curious little note for this. Okay, I guess it's just not going to launch for me. Is that who's involved with this is Lee DeForest. Does anybody know the name DeForest?
No.
Well, he's the guy who came up with the idea of vacuum tubes. So without him, we don't have much of an art that we have today as far as music technology goes. He's pretty important.
New York, 1920. Silent movies are all the rage, but the stars of the silver screen won't stay silent for long if Lee DeForest has his way. DeForest is already a famous inventor, but not famous enough. He wants to be a household name, just like Thomas Edison.
He was, shall we say, a unique and difficult individual to work with, to put it mildly. He worked best alone. He was a maverick. He certainly looked for ways of doing things that have been rejected by others.
DeForest's biggest success, the Audion tube in 1906, boosted telephone signals and created long-distance calling. But 14 years later, at age 47, he's desperate to come up with a big new idea to keep him in the limelight.
That man is so handsome. I can only imagine what he sounds like.
Maybe that's the ticket. Bring sound to the movies. DeForest figures if he could pull that off, he'd be a worldwide sensation.
With his background in audio engineering and amplification, that developing a working sound on film system was about the one last thing that he could do and he could make work as the lone inventor working in his back room.
But how to do it? The big challenge, as DeForest is about to discover, is that recording sound and recording film are two totally different technologies.
DeForest talking picture test number 1. This test is to determine the potential of a gramophone disc as a sound receptacle and playback device.
DeForest uses a horn which acts like a microphone to capture the sound waves produced by his voice. Those sound waves will then vibrate a needle and etch his words into the grooves of a soft wax disc. But when DeForest tries to match up the gramophone disc recording with the moving picture, there's a fundamental problem.
DeForest talking picture test number 1. This test is to determine the potential of a gramophone disc as a sound receptacle and playback device.
The mouth and the words keep going out of sync. It just doesn't work. DeForest comes back to the workshop with a glimmer of an idea. How about using light to record the sound right onto the film, just like a picture?
Which meant it always stayed in synchronization with the picture. They were physically the same bit of film, so they couldn't not stay in synchronization.
Testing.
DeForest connects his microphone to a light bulb device he calls a photon.
As the sound got louder, the light bulb would get brighter. As the sound got quieter, the light bulb would get dimmer.
After months of trial and error, they install the photon inside the camera and roll film.
This test is to determine the potential of sound exposed on film.
Inside the camera, the flickering photon exposes the sound of his voice onto the film. As it shifts from dim to bright, the photon creates a barcode down the edge of each frame. Each pulse of light creates a stripe that varies with the rhythm and intensity of his voice. DeForest has invented what's now known as optical sound. But does it work on playback? DeForest develops the film and puts it through a projector that converts the optical soundtrack back into sound. It plays in perfect sync, but now there's another problem. DeForest can barely make out the words. It's a huge disappointment. DeForest is on the verge of a breakthrough, but he can kiss fame goodbye if he can't get clearer sound.
He was also running out of money.
DeForest realizes what's causing the problem. His flickering photon bulb that exposed the sound onto the film isn't sensitive enough to accurately reproduce human speech. He's forced to admit he needs help.
Mr. DeForest, Theodore Case, at your service.
Theodore Case, a former Navy engineer, has worked independently on sensitive light signaling technology. DeForest knows he needs Case, but he's not keen on sharing the glory.
DeForest had very, very difficult working relationships with his closest collaborators. So instead of working with them in a way that mutually benefited them both, he wanted to go home with all the prizes.
An awkward situation. But Case needs DeForest's big name to boost his career, as much as DeForest needs Case's better light technology. Case adds a tiny, highly sensitive light bulb, which he calls an exciter lamp, to DeForest's sound system. It captures greater degrees of brightness than the photon bulb, so it's far more sensitive to the nuances of the voice. It could be the missing piece of the puzzle. Several months later, they're finally ready for a test. Whether or not their relationship is working, the important thing now is how the new light bulb performs. DeForest's legacy rides on what happens next.
DeForest talking picture. Hi. DeForest and Case, test number 3.
This time, the sound is perfectly clear. DeForest and Case have brought sound to the silver screen.
Okay. That is likely not exactly how it happened.
It's so dramatic.
And nobody remembers either of them.
Into the microphone on that person, it sounded just like some kid in Call of Duty that was like has the microphone in his throat.
All right. So, yeah. So anyway, that's, I suppose, more entertaining to watch, but a grain of salt, that seems awfully dramatic. Okay. So let me stop the share. Right, so this is important stuff, right? And there's some names involved that actually connect us again to sort of the music technology realm, with DeForest being someone whose vacuum tubes lend us the vacuum amplifiers and audio amplification. It's all very important, but also maybe a little known fact was largely responsible for the invention of optical soundtracks. So to give you an idea of that, optical soundtrack is about 3 millimeters wide. It doesn't take up nearly as much space as the whole film. So we see what's important actually physically is like there's 3 millimeters given to the sound, and then a whole bunch of millimeters, about 35 of them, I guess, given to the image. Okay, so next up we want to talk about Oscar Fischinger a little bit. So Oscar Fischinger, we discussed last time briefly, but we're going to discuss him a lot more this time. So he's making film, abstract film, in Germany in the 20s, and eventually makes his way over to the United States. There's a lot of things happening in Germany that someone might want to leave and go to a different country for a little while to escape the horrors of regime change. And so there's a lot of sort of immigration and different forces coming into the United States, especially on the West Coast around Hollywood. So Oscar Fischinger moves from Germany to California, and that's sort of a really important element because there's a West Coast sort of art movement associated with film. So at that time, if you're a composer, then you're very interested in the technologies coming out in Los Angeles at that time. So let's talk a bit about Oscar Fischinger here. Okay. So what this allows, the fact that we can record sounds onto the optical soundtrack, is obviously we can record things, but what Oscar Fischinger discovers is that maybe it's possible to synthesize sound on this optical soundtrack. So Oscar Fischinger, up to this point, as we looked at last time, has been making sort of figures to accompany existing pieces of music. So he's kind of like making music videos. He has to get, a piece by Liszt, for instance, the Hungarian Rhapsody, and analyze that score and then make film that synchronizes with it exactly, which is, he's able to actually present that because we can have the Hungarian Rhapsody on the optical soundtrack and play it back. And then he, through a lot of hard work, tedious work, is able to then make exact sort of animation figures to go along with that music. So let's look at that. This is an optical poem from 1938. And you will see that it is given, the whole Hollywood treatment here. That's not what I wanted. The whole Hollywood treatment here, that we get all the things we expect from film. So he's making probably the most accessible use of this. But I want to watch an optical poem really fast. It's a remarkable work of art that is put to music, and just examine the way that he is using shape through time to express that music. So let me share the screen again. I'll look at all the chats after the, do I need to look at the chats? I don't think so. I'll look at those after class usually. Okay, so here we go. An optical poem. Did I share the sound? Let's make sure I did. Well, that's pretty good stuff. So how did he do that?
Is that frame by frame?
That was frame by frame,
Oh
stop
my
motion.
Wow.
A
lot of time.
Yeah. So a lot of time. I mean, there's a lot of things here that have to happen, right? So how do you make that with stop motion? Well, you have to translate all musical time of this to frame per second and then shoot your stop motion in accordance. And that is crazy. This piece is all of paper cutouts. This is the one I was talking about last time that John Cage actually helped him work on before he got fired. And you move these pieces of paper millimeter by millimeter, all hung with fishing line from a structure. So that's really insane. I think it took him over a year to do this. And really impressive work for that time, just because of the tedium involved, I think, and the ability to focus past all of that and still create what you need to create. Okay, but for us, in a sense, that's great, but we're still setting like a romantic piece of music, right? And what Oscar Fischinger here is able to do is actually make money with his abstract film, right? So this is a vehicle for him to present abstract film, but now there's a reason for people or something for them to grab onto. The art within them responds to this because it's familiar music. But at the same time, he was also doing some things that were maybe more avant-garde than that, and maybe more forward-looking. So I want to read a little bit of this paper that's from Oscar Fischinger, and he's talking about klingende Ornamenta, so sounding ornaments, is what he starts talking about. Because, okay, so if you're Oscar Fischinger, you think, all right, I'm putting all of these images in some way to correspond to music. And I'm writing them with light on the optical soundtrack. And they have this sort of look, right? So if we look at the optical soundtrack, it looks like something. So he starts wondering, is it possible that I could just draw sound directly? Can I directly synthesize sound with drawings and have it make sense? Maybe my abstract visualizations are somehow directly related. What happens if I draw directly into the soundtrack with a pen? And so here's his paper that talks about that. I won't read the whole thing. But he says, between ornament and music persist direct connections, which means that ornaments are music. So here he's talking about visual ornaments. If you look at a strip of film from my experiments with synthetic sound, you will see along one edge a thin strip of jagged ornamental patterns. So let me share the screen for a second so we can look at his experiments. I'll just share this much of it. So here we see his drawings of ornamental sound. You might be able to, with your futuristic knowledge, imagine what these might sound like. Obviously, the smoother shapes are going to have less harmonics, and the sharper shapes will have more harmonics. These overlapped sort of patterns might imply certain harmonics above a fundamental, the fundamental being determined by how many of these shapes occur per second. So we have to imagine if this is 24 frames per second and that's one frame, then that's going to give us a certain frequency. Like that's how he might determine that. This one looks particularly interesting to me. So he's making these sort of abstract figures and then sounding them quite literally. Okay, these ornaments are drawn music. They have sound when run through a projector. These graphic sounds broadcast tones or a hitherto unheard of purity, and thus quite obviously fantastic possibilities open up for the composition of music in the future. Undoubtedly, the composer of tomorrow will no longer write mere notes, which the composer himself can never realize definitely, but which rather must languish, abandoned to various capricious reproducers. That's not a very nice way to refer to performers, as capricious reproducers. Now control of every fine gradation and nuance is granted to the music painting artist, who bases everything exclusively on the primary fundamental of music, namely the wave, vibration or oscillation in and of itself. In this process, surface now surface new perceptions that until now were overlooked and remain neglected. Possibilities that are definitely significant for a scrupulous and profound creator of music, for example. Precise overtones or timbres characteristic of a certain voice or instrument can be reproduced with accurate fidelity through these drawn patterns. Or, when desirable, the profile of sound waves could be synchronized exactly, wave trowel with wave trowel, so that their dead centers would coincide, sounding in perfect accord. Or furthermore, new musical sounds are now possible, pure tones with a precision of definition in their musical vibrations that could not be obtained formally from the manipulation of traditional instruments. Okay, so I'll leave that there. Obviously, this is quite forward-looking, and I think we have to admit here that the synthesizers of the 40s, in the Cologne School of Germany, who are doing the synthesis, must have known about Fischinger's work, right? You have to know about this optical soundtrack work. And here he's saying things that Varese is saying in the late 20s. He's definitely tuned in to the new music scene somehow. Okay, interesting stuff. And I want to read a little bit. I don't have time to read a lot of this, but I want to read about how Cage and Fischinger are related. Not by blood, but by idea. And I'll just read a little bit of this. So this is from the article called "The Spirit Inside Each Object, John Cage, Oskar Fischinger, and the Future of Music." That's in quotes. And so here's, I talked earlier about Fischinger's interest in percussion, and that's going to come up here. So in the summer of 1937, the young John Cage arrived at Oskar Fischinger's temporary animation studio in Hollywood, recently hired as the filmmaker's assistant. Cage's brief apprenticeship, by all accounts lasting no more than a few days, soon became a recurring subject in the composer's personal history, retold in interviews and articles. It's well known that Cage composed his first works for percussion around the same time as his interactions with Fischinger. So he wrote a lot of percussion music in the 30s, leading critics, scholars, and artists to speculate on the implications of Cage's claim that his time with the filmmaker led me to percussion. Although eureka moments make for excellent memoirs, and Cage's biography is full of such examples, determining any direct lineage or influence for Cage's intellectual or compositional breakthroughs is difficult, given his proclivity for colorful personal narrative that both simplified and obscured the complex web of influences that shaped his career. Recent scholarship on Cage's early career has made great strides in clarifying dates, contexts, and source materials in an effort to contextualize his work within the blossoming and diverse artistic culture of Los Angeles and the West Coast in general. Continuing in this trend, this article explores recently unearthed archival documentation that clarifies many details of Cage's relationship to Fischinger, and in turn reveals Cage's involvement with contemporary developments in music synthesis and recording technologies for film and other media. Cage's understanding of these technologies was fostered by a heretofore unacknowledged aspect of his early career, research he undertook for his father, John Cage Sr., on a series of patents in television and infrared vision technology. Although other writers on Cage's relationship with his father explored the notion of invention as a metaphor for the composer's artistic program in general, this article provides the first documented evidence of Cage Jr.'s understanding of electronic technology and practical implications in composition. And it goes on. My page has stopped responding. And let's see. Okay. So, Cage's first encountered precedents for visual music during his travels to Europe in 1930 and 31. The journal Transition, devoted to U.S. artists living in Europe, functioned as a cultural guidebook for Americans abroad and was repeatedly cited by Cage as an important source of information and ideas. Several articles echoing the manifestos of early filmmakers and theorists like Sergei Eisenstein, Germain Dulac, and Giga Vertov extolled the revolutionary potential of the new art form of the sound film. Calls within Transition for experimental approaches to sound film opposed industry norms and encouraged an engagement with the materiality of the medium itself. Throughout the 1920s, Oscar Fischinger and other artists answered the calls in transition. A school of abstract film formed around several venues, particularly in Berlin, and included such artists as Viking Egeling, Walter Ruttmann, and Hans Richter. In 1926, Fischinger toured with the Hungarian composer Alexandra Laszlo, presenting a series of color light music concerts consisting of simultaneous projections of Fischinger's abstract films, and so forth. And so I'll stop there. I would like for you to read that article yourself. And what ends up happening is there's this comment by Fischinger. I'm not reading this, but he tells Cage that there's this sort of, that every object has, what does he call it exactly?
Spirit?
The spirit inside each object. And all you have to do is brush past it to evoke it. Right. And so that's Cage's approach to percussion in a sense. I mean, I find this quite interesting if you know anything about John Cage, because we find a lot of the ideas very fundamental here. One, that time is probably the most important thing. That's what makes music, right? So for Cage, time is everything. And here we have this crazy 1937 working experience where someone is actually moving frame by frame in time and having to draw these things that are beneath the frame in order to make fundamental frequencies. This had to have an influence, right? For one, the tedium of it would make an impression on you. And also we have this idea that all objects sort of have inherent within them some spirit. And so Cage's idea of anything as a musical object maybe has some roots here as well. I think that's really interesting. Okay, Oscar Fischinger himself had some musical training. He wasn't foreign to this, and he was in the know with some film composers at the time as well. So he's doing a lot of musical experiments. At the same time, I'm going to just brush past now Oscar Fischinger, even though there's a lot more to talk about. At the same time, there's a Canadian named Norman McLaren who is also interested in drawing on the film. So remember, we're talking about 3 millimeters of space. Fischinger predicts that in the future, that music will get dedicated a lot more than 3 millimeters to the film. It'll be the whole film, because then we could have really good sound. So he's an audiophile too, and I think to an extent it's just super hard to draw 3 millimeter wide things. Norman McLaren is on the same path, and he is interested in animated, so he's also a filmmaker, so he's interested in animating films and having it be exactly synchronized in the soundtrack. And so what we hear from Norman McLaren is not a recorded soundtrack of Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody, but rather drawn waveforms exactly synchronized with his own animation. So here we have the multimedia exemplar of Norman McLaren, who is using this medium to create unified audiovisual works. So let's listen to one or two, because they're great. So here's well, let's listen to him explain what he's doing. I guess that's first, and then we'll listen to a piece. And so this is pinpoint percussion, and it's one of these Canadian film board things, which are a treasure trove. And let's just watch it. I don't need to talk about it.
Ever think what a sound looks like? An artist might picture it this way. But a musician sees it differently. The The sound engineer has an oscilloscope to help him see sounds. Let's have a few notes on the guitar. And there's another way these notes can be seen. The vibrating strings set up vibrations in the air, which travel to the microphone. And then an electronic device translates them into vibrations of light. This narrow beam of light is photographed on movie film and gives you the soundtrack, which doesn't appear on the screen. But let's bring it out of hiding where we can see it. Come on. All right, now, give us that guitar again. So that's a picture of the guitar notes. Well, can you show us some other instrument? Uh-huh. What else can you do? Not bad. Try again. You know, that's a mighty fine-looking voice. Wonder what you could do with my voice. Shall we try it? This is my voice. Hey, wait a minute. Let's hold that still and look at it again. So that's how my voice looks. Like every other sound, it has its own distinct pattern of light and dark running down the side of the film. Well, if a sound will make a pattern on film, a pattern on film will make a sound. You can even create your own sounds by drawing directly on the film. Norman McLaren, the motion picture artist, has been making some hand-drawn sounds, and now he's going to hear them for the first time, played on the moviola, a sort of miniature movie projector. It's not just guesswork. The sound of any of these patterns of lines can be calculated. The size controls the loudness. A row of small marks would sound like this. Larger marks, a louder sound. That's simple enough. Then there's the tone quality. It's controlled by the shape of the marks. This series of thin, straight lines gives a sharp, rather unpleasant sound. But these round dots are a bit smoother. The marks can be any shape you like. Now, how about this? Using the brush, Norman tries a row of small triangles. These sharp, angular forms, what would they sound like? The distance the lines are apart controls pitch. With the lines far apart, a low-pitched note, a medium, and a high note. Now, what can they be used for, these hand-drawn sounds? Well, Norman McLaren finds that they are a perfectly natural accompaniment to some of his hand-drawn motion pictures. Each movement of the screen can have its own specially designed sound. Making movies this way, the artist has direct personal control at every stage of the film's production. Sound and picture are planned and closely related to each other as they are drawn. Now Norman is checking to make sure that each bit of sound is perfectly matched to its accompanying screen action. Finally, the picture and the sound will be printed together on one length of film, and color will be added during the process.
Okay, so that's how he does it. And then let's watch a piece that demonstrates that. So let's watch Dots from 1940. Oh, wait. 59 people don't like this on YouTube. It's important. Okay, so there's several of those for you to check out. They're awfully charming and pretty interesting in that he's able to accomplish this through the medium. Oh, sorry, something's playing in my ear. Okay, so there's your homework is that there are several things to watch. I put them on the folio page. There's these notes and links. I didn't get to read something that I guess I'll read next time regarding Fischinger. It's pretty interesting, but we don't have time to go through it. So the point of this whole bit is to get us from the idea of just abstract film without sound to the revolutionary media invention of sound on film optically, and the fact that it is a cross-modal idea from the start. And Norman McLaren is actually the one taking full advantage of that with hand-drawn things on film, both sound and visual. And then Oscar Fischinger being someone who has this idea of sounding ornaments and really takes it a long way with the idea of what does sound actually look like when we synthesize it, and the idea of synthesized sound in general from an optical standpoint. So you get to read through that and make sure you look at the Norman McLaren stuff and the other videos I've put on that notes and links. And then there's this 4-part animation thing, which is really slow to watch, but I'm encouraging you to watch it. It just talks about some fundamentals of animation. And later, I just want to use those as sort of jumping off points for can we make things that do these sort of typical animation things using our current technologies that make life a lot easier for us. Okay, any questions or comments about any of this? I know Jarrett's digging the Norman McLaren thing.
I think that it's great that we have to have this type of sessions where we really analyze the art and the technicalities and the technology. I think it's very valuable to understand what is it that we're trying to do, or at least where does it come from. So I really value that.
Yeah, I think it's really important with this because this is not something we study as undergraduate music majors, right? It's actually we've chosen a different historical perspective, but I would argue in many ways that this is foundational for a lot of things that we're familiar with now. And also I think it's interesting to think about what would be an equivalent revelation now, right? I mean, this is crazy to think about, that sound was not on film and then it was. And someone came up with that and then made art with it. What is that now? Is kind of an interesting idea. Maybe sound in DNA, something biological or something like that. Anyway, so I appreciate all of your attention. Go Vikings, Andrew says. And remember that on Thursday you have this one assignment that's due, which is to try to make the red cross in the matrix. Andrew pointed out this is a bit of a bug in Max that you will not be able to make that happen on load. So a load bang to a matrix does not draw into a P window correctly.
I got it to load. I had to do some other stuff. I'm trying to remember what I did.
Yeah.
I think I banged it, and then I had to defer low.
Right. You have to put it at the end of the queue at least. That might work. But there's some bug with it where it doesn't work as expected. And actually with GL3, if you print it to a JIT window, sorry to use weird terms, but for GL3, if you print it directly to a JIT window, it actually works. So it is something about the scheduling, but that's beyond our concern. So if I can just open up the patch and hit a button and it works, that's also fine. Thank you for pointing out the bug, Andrew. It was interesting. All right, so I will see you guys when I see you. Welcome back to this shortened week. We'll make it through.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
And I'll post this video. All right.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.